My name is Jeffrey Herbst, and I'm president of American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Welcome to the inaugural event in our President's Speaker Series. As part of AJU's continuing commitment to provide high-quality public education to the worldwide community concerned with Jewish issues, we've devised this series to explore some of the most pertinent and vexing issues of the day with high-profile speakers. There's no more appropriate person to lead off this series than Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, long the nation's preeminent American organization fighting anti-Semitism. Especially given the surge in anti-Semitism that we have seen since October 7th, we're gratified to welcome Jonathan back to our digital platform. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. A pleasure to be here and to be supporting AJU.
Recently, ADL reported that the number of anti-Semitic incidents had soared an extraordinary 360% since October 7th. Can you describe, as you see it, the contours of this extraordinary rise in hatred against Jews?
Well, I guess there are a few things. So first of all, I think it's fair to say that ADL, in living memory, has just never seen a moment like this before. So some might say that in the 1930s, with the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, you saw spasms of anti-Semitism here in the US, but of course, they were not documented and tracked the way we do that work now. Nonetheless, you may have had a Father Coughlin or a Henry Ford. You certainly, though, did not have, Facebook and Instagram. So the amplification and the spread of these things was entirely different 100 years ago or 90 years ago than what we're seeing now. But now the numbers are really staggering, Jeff. So whereas we already were seeing the rise of anti-Semitism in recent years, ADL has been tracking this for almost 45 years. And in the last decade, we've seen the numbers grow 400+%. We've hit record highs of acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence targeting the Jewish community in 2019, 2021, and 2022. 2023 was tracking just like 2022, about the same rate. Again, demonstrably more than we were at a decade ago. And then October the 7th happened. And we saw a tsunami of anti-Jewish hate. And by the way, Jeffrey, it did not happen when the IDF went into Gaza to rescue the hostages. It did not happen when the IDF started dropping leaflets in Gaza, encouraging the civilian population to move. It started on October the 7th. And this explosion included 3,291 acts of hate. That is literally more than 3.5 times what we had for the same period last year. Again, last year, the worst year ever. And it was 361% greater this time around. We're talking about almost 6 assaults, over 550 cases of vandalism, over 1,340 or so acts of harassment, and over 1,300 examples of public manifestations in protest or actions of explicit, indisputable anti-Semitic hate. So this is absolutely a moment in time, from our college campuses to our workplaces, to other public spaces, to the halls of Congress, to the corridors of power. We are feeling a degree of pressure and a kind of animus that it simply is without parallel. And there's a reason why people feel alarmed in our community, because the data tells us that something is different and it's dangerous, like literally dangerous in a way we haven't seen before.
Jonathan, that's extremely sobering. It wasn't like before October 7th, as you mentioned, that anti-Semitism had been ignored. Of course, your organization has been in place and growing for many years. And there's a plethora of organizations seemingly at every point in the ideological spectrum, including AJC, Hillel, Stand With Us, ZOA, as well as many others fighting anti-Semitism. In the last few decades across the nation, we've seen dozens of Holocaust museums and memorials put up. Yet at the same time, we saw what you described as a tsunami of anti-Semitism. What happened? Was it just too much for all these organizational efforts? Was it different? Was it unexpected?
Well, I mean, I think there are a few things. I mean, number one, you're right to point out we have been in, I don't know that I would say anti-Semitism was ignored. I mean, think about, there was efforts like Robert Kraft's Stand Up to Anti-Semitism campaign. There was the Shine a Light effort organized by the Kirsch Foundation. There were other efforts by ADL and other organizations to try to cast a light. And, you know, we have a lot of allies and a lot of friends and a lot of supporters. That being said, I think what happened on the 7th was cataclysmic. And I think one of the things that we know that we talked about in our prior Zoom is that, look, I wrote a book on this, that when you demonize people, when you delegitimize them, when you render them as objects of hate, guess what happens? People treat them as objects of hate. People treat them as illegitimate. People do inhumane things because the person is kind of denuded of any identity. They're just an object of your bigotry and your venom. And so I think if you look at the ugly, gruesome attack, the massacre on these civilians, by the way, Israelis and non-Israelis, overwhelmingly Jews, but many non-Jews, overwhelmingly Israeli, but non-Israelis, right? There were people from multiple ethnicities and multiple nationalities who were kidnapped or killed, who were brutalized and raped and maimed and executed and on and on. But I think to come back to home, I mean, I've been saying for years that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Anyone who thinks it isn't is simply not paying attention. And if for those people who still are confused, Exhibit A is not October the 7th, what happened in Israel. It's October the 7th, what happened here. When you so revile Zionism and Zionists that you think it's reasonable to rape and murder them, when you lose sight of the fact that they are human beings, I think you are the one who has lost your humanity. So when we ask, well, why did this happen and how did this happen? First and foremost, I think the preponderance of hateful rhetoric targeting Israelis, targeting Jews, targeting Zionists, it's been tolerated for far too long. People in positions of authority have excused it as if it was political speech. It's not political speech. There's nothing wrong with criticizing Israeli policies. Like there's nothing wrong with criticizing the policies of any government. But again, these relentless campaigns to dehumanize and to racialize and to render as evil Zionists, let's just recognize what this is. It's the old wine of anti-Semitism in a fancy new bottle of 21st century, political speak. But it's the same kind of hate, just not directed against the Jewish people, directed against the Jewish state. So number one, I think it happened because we tolerated it for way too long. People in positions of authority. I think secondly, we also need to acknowledge that extremists feel emboldened in this environment, and these things are related. They're not sort of mutually exclusive. So tolerating people who say hateful things, guess what? The lack of deterrence means they feel emboldened. And we see them running for office. We see them in positions of authority in the faculty lounge, right? Or the chair of the department, or even in the president's office in the halls of power, your counterparts at other institutions. And now they're not all extremists, don't get me wrong, but there are definitely people, these radicalized student activists. What do you think happens after they grab their diploma and they walk off the stage? They don't disappear into the ether. Guess what? They get jobs. And yeah, maybe some of them are working as baristas at a local coffee shop, and some of them are working at the CSR desks of companies, and some of them are working for the local kind of PERG or nonprofit. And some of them are going into teaching, and some of them are going into other fields, and some of them are going back into academia. So I say this because extremists feel emboldened when they are not called out, when their hateful rhetoric isn't shut down. And then thirdly, the third factor that built on all this, something I alluded to a minute ago, which is social media. Social media is a super spreader of anti-Semitism and really evil. It allows for the spread of evil and wickedness in ways you couldn't just imagine before. I mean, it wasn't like there weren't snuff films, but in an earlier time, but you couldn't find them. Now the Hamas terrorists are making their own with GoPro cameras and gleefully uploading them in real time on the social media feeds of their victims. It is sick and deranged. And so social media is an amplifier, it is an expander, it is sort of a super highway of the worst content that again spawns copycats and creates memes and other things that actually encourage this. So all those things together, I believe, Jeff, the normalization of anti-Semitism, the energy among extremists, and the kind of pervasiveness of social media created this perfect storm in which 10/7 happened.
Jonathan, as you know, there was a debate before October 7th about where the biggest threat to the Jewish community came from, left or right, to simplify it. And while anyone can be dangerous with a gun, as we saw at Tree of Life, it appears now that the left can scale in a way that the right cannot. Going forward, do you think there has to be a reallocation of the effort in fighting anti-Semitism between looking at left-wing and right-wing extremists?
Well, I think there are, I mean, look, let me step back. Number one, I don't agree with the premise of not your question, but the frame. What's the biggest threat? I've used the analogy of climate change before. And I don't know if you recall this or not. I don't know if I did it on the Zoom, but I feel like to consider these threats is like thinking about the climate. So on the one hand, I would characterize the threat of the extreme right, and I have characterized the extreme right, like a Category 5 hurricane, like a 7.2 earthquake in Southern California. It hits you, the house falls in the crevice, and like everybody dies. And it's coming and it happens and there's nothing to do about it. And you can predict it. You know it's going to happen and it will kill everyone. Boom. The anti-Semitism of the kind of radical left is more like climate change. If you could watch my hand. Can you see my hand here? Starts here. Starts low and people don't notice it. And then the temperature rises and some people dismiss it. And it keeps rising and other people, they acknowledge it, but they ignore it. And then it keeps rising and then people deny it. And then it keeps rising. And then people say, okay, well, it's real. We'll just adapt to it. And then it keeps rising and say, okay, well, maybe we can just, and suddenly it's up here. And in an environment where it's so hot, the environment, the climate is so inhospitable, you can't live there. And guess what happens? Category 5 hurricanes, 7.2 earthquakes. So both of these are threats. It's just the sequence with which they will kill you. So I will not minimize the threat from the extreme right. These are the people shooting Jews in Poway. These are at the Skirball Center trying to kill us, trying to kill our kids in Pittsburgh, let alone in El Paso and in Buffalo and in Jacksonville and on and on. And on the other hand, like I won't deny the very real threat of the hateful anti-Zionists who create the kind of climate where that man was bludgeoned to death with a megaphone. I think it was in Simi Valley. I think it was in Ventura County. So these are both threats. And so I just don't accept the premise that, well, which is worse? I mean, we live in this sort of like, do you watch Fox or MSNBC, right? Do you read the New York Times op-ed or the Wall Street Journal op-ed page? Are you on the red team or the blue team? And I think as Jews, we need to acknowledge that the threats come from multiple directions, from the extreme right, from the hard left, from religious extremists, Islamic, jihadists, Christian nationalists, Nation of Islam, Black Hebrew Israelites, let alone the other sort of John Birchers and Lyndon LaRouche types, and I could go on, the QAnon. So there are a lot of threats, Jeff, and I just don't think it's this or that. It's all of the above. Now, it's fair to say, well, you still have to apportion resources, and we do. And we are constantly making decisions, but we spend a lot of time monitoring and working to disrupt threats from all sides because all of them are problematic, and all of them could kill us. By the way, last point, I can't remember the French political philosopher who said, like, there's kind of a horseshoe effect in politics. The extreme right and the radical left, they're not like on a 180-degree line. They're like a 355-degree circle. Like they basically touch like a horseshoe up here. And it's true. The extreme right yells about Zionist-occupied government. The hard left yells about, AIPAC-bought government. The far right claims George Soros and Rockefeller. And now the hard left is saying horrible things about Bill Ackman and, who they perceive, and Sheldon Adelson of, blessed memory. I mean, it's crazy to see the symmetry between the extremists, but it's there.
Jonathan, let me ask you about allyship, which has always been a core concern of ADL, which of course was founded to stop the defamation of Jews, but also to put an end to injustice against all people. Let me read you a quote from Senator Schumer's speech on the Senate floor. Not long ago, many of us Jews marched together for Black and brown lives. We stood against anti-Asian hatred. We protested bigotry against the LGBTQ community. We fought for reproductive justice out of recognition that injustice against one oppressed group is injustice against all. But apparently, Senator Schumer concluded, in the eyes of some, that principle does not extend to the Jewish people. What's your assessment of allyship after October 7th?
Okay, there are a couple things. So I really respect Majority Leader Schumer, and I appreciated his really remarkable speech. And if you haven't seen it, maybe someone could put the link in the chat. It's worth watching. It's heartfelt and it's genuine. And I don't know if I spoke to him while he was writing it and gave him some counsel. To hear him tell me, I don't think he'd ever spoken so personally with such exposition about his own views and his own life, etc., as a Jew. So it's very meaningful. Look, I think this has been a challenging moment on many fronts. And for an organization like ADL, which prides itself in working with other communities, it's been hard. Now, I will say up front that I don't agree with the premise that we've been abandoned by our allies. I don't think so. We do have allies. They are showing up. The first call that I got that day was from Al Sharpton. In less than 24, and Al Sharpton is someone who's been very controversial to many in our community for years. Now, I'm not a native New Yorker. I wasn't here when all these things happened, but I've heard the stories, and I've talked to the people in Brooklyn who experienced this. So I get it. And yet at the same time, his call was, what can I do? When I told him you should make a statement, within 24 hours, he and Martin Luther King III and the NAACP and the Urban League and others all released a joint statement together decrying the violence of 10/7, the massacre against Israelis. Full stop, no qualifications. And then a day or two later, I got a call from Michael Lomax at the United Negro College Fund, who said, how can I help? Here's what you can do. And boom, they released a statement, as did the Asian American Foundation, as did some other groups. Now, look, at the same time, and by the way, celebrities like Bono or The Rock or a number of others like leapt to the social media without hesitation. Now, on the other hand, I wish every single celebrity, every single influencer, every single person of authority, every single civil rights ally spoke out quickly and clearly and did so consistently. Let me see if I can get this here. I'm wearing this every day to remind me of what's happening. I wish these other allies would show up and every day remind us that they are keeping us in mind. That's not happening, and it's problematic. Now, I think some of it is because the anti-Zionist left has convinced the world that somehow Zionism is controversial. They've convinced the world that Israel is responsible for all the evils and such. And that, look, it's very troubling. I'm going to adjust my chain here. It's very bothersome. We got to fight that fight and not cede the ground to them, although I'm afraid we have in some ways. Like I said before, we've been way too tolerant of the anti-Zionist left for far too long. Now, secondly, I think let's acknowledge, I was talking about social media before, Jeff, like everybody's in their own filter bubble. So you're on your phone and you're only hearing what you hear. What you're hearing on your phone is different than what someone else is hearing on their phone or reading on their phone and so on. Because the content is algorithmically, tailored to you based on what you click. So if you're not in the zone about every day reading what's happening in Gaza, reading what happened in Kfar Aza, or reading what happened in Berry, or reading what happened in Okafim, you don't know what's going on. You think life is about basketball scores and I don't know, whatever, just life. So I think the truth is that our allies don't always know what we're going through, even if some of them feel chastened or worried about the politics. So it's incumbent upon us to reach out. I mean, Hillel's adage tells us, if I am not for myself, who will be? Being for ourselves doesn't mean doing that in silence. We need to reach out to our allies. We need to let them know where we're coming from. We need to help them understand how we are hurting. Because they may be on the sidelines. I mean, and that's something to keep in mind, Jeff. We talk about where our allies. It's one thing to be on the sidelines. It's another thing to be playing for the other team. Now, it's a crude metaphor, right? I don't mean to relegate this to like some sports thing. It's much more serious and grave than that. But nonetheless, a lot of our allies have been quiet, if you will, on the sidelines. They're not picking up the ball and putting on the uniform for the other team. So keep that in mind. And again, I would encourage everyone, if you're watching, if you're worried, reach out to your friends. Let them know where you're coming from. And in that act of building awareness, it gives your ally, it gives your friend, it gives our partners the opportunity to engage with us together.
Jonathan, you referred before to social media as a super spreader. We've talked about Facebook before. You've done important work on Facebook. One of the new entrants in social media, especially influential among young people, is TikTok, which has been especially controversial. How do you understand TikTok as a kind of vector of anti-Semitism?
Well, I guess there are a few things. I mean, anti-Semitism didn't start with TikTok, right? And moreover, it didn't start with social media. It's often described as the oldest hatred, and it morphs and it kind of mutates and it rides on different platforms. So, Henry Ford took advantage of the advent of newspaper inserts, and he used the Dearborn Independent to publish what he did. And Father Coughlin took advantage of the advent of radio to spread his ugly message out. And then the LaRouches and the other white supremacists took advantage of cable access television in the 70s. And a number of right-wing extremists like armed militia enthusiasts took advantage of the early BBS, bulletin board systems in the days of dial-up. Flash forward to today, it shouldn't surprise us, like extremists exploit new technologies because they have to find ways to route around the barriers that are put up by normal people who don't want their poison to infect, the water supply. So they've adopted social media, and TikTok is the latest kind of iteration, the short form video platform that has grown like gangbusters. I mean, it's been around for less than 3 years, and it has, I think, 2 billion users. It's grown at a faster rate than Facebook did in its day. It's really pretty stunning. And it's, no surprise, filled with disinformation, filled with misinformation. Is TikTok worse than the other platforms? TikTok is as bad as the other platforms. I'm not sure that it's worse. None of them are great. So let's be truthful. I mean, the reality is that from Facebook to Instagram to X to Reddit to Discord to TikTok to YouTube Shorts, I mean, none of these are great. All of them have lots of content on there that I find highly objectionable. At the same time, I mean, I believe, this is my view, hate speech is the price of free speech. I don't think we should censor everything. And there's some who take a very censorious approach. I don't. What I believe is that content can be up there. We don't, though, need to make it easy to find. My 14-year-old shouldn't be a click away from hideous, grotesque, hateful content. That's number one. And number two, I believe that so there are tools you can use that the platforms could use to better mediate, to better moderate, to better manage the content on their systems. And secondly, I believe that the regulators, our government has a role to play here. In the same way that if at AJU, in one of your publications, you slander someone or libel them, you are liable for that. And if you print something or post something or publish something, you can be sued if the information is factually incorrect and harmful. Has to be proven in court, of course, right? Nonetheless, there are civil remedies when you harm someone. Same thing here. There should be civil remedies available to injured parties when content is published on Facebook or Instagram or X or any of those services that harms them, including TikTok. Now, there's a loophole in the law that prevents that, Jeff. It's called Section 230. We can talk about that later if you want, or double click on it and drill down. But the bottom line is that TikTok is a problem. It's not the only problem. None of them are great. I believe that we have to recognize that content we don't like is, again, the price of living in a democracy, but the company should make it harder to find. Friction is a good thing in this case, and government should make those companies liable for when they publish libel. I think it's pretty simple.
Jonathan, maybe we talk, as you mentioned, college campuses, and let me read the question that one of our listeners wrote in. Here she writes, I work at a large public university on the West Coast. While things aren't as bad here as anything you might read about, they're far from good. What are the practical steps we can take to improve Jewish student life on campus?
Some of this depends on the institution, of course, but I can give some general thoughts. I don't know where this person is, if they're at, a Cal State school or a UC school or whatever. But I would say there are steps we would encourage universities to take to make sure there's no tolerance for anti-Semitism on their campus. And in fact, we just launched a campaign today focused on this. Now, historically, ADL has not been on college campuses. College campuses, as you know better than I, Jeff, they are crowded with groups seeking to support the Jewish community, from Hillel to Advocacy, which does Jewish Life, Hillel or Chabad on campus, to groups like AIPAC or Stand With Us, or many others that sort of do what I might call pro-Israel work on campus. J Street U is another one. There are others. So we're not on campus. We haven't been. I think there are others who are covering the waterfront, and what we do it. And by the way, then there are institutions like AEPI and ZBT and SAMI and Jewish sororities that support Jewish life on these campuses. So we have not been there historically. Okay, well, that's been an approach that we've adopted. We have modified our approach relative to, changing circumstances and exogenous things like 10-7. So now, previous to 10-7, we had partnerships with ZBT and API, with Hillel. And we're working with all of them to give them content and support for Jewish students to help them deal with anti-Semitism. Now, in light of 10-7, we're being more aggressive. And we launched this campaign. We did it with Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism. We should talk about that, by the way. So put a pin in that, if you will, for a moment. We'll come back to it. What we're doing is basically trying to leverage the grassroots energy out there to help push campuses to take steps to make our Jewish students as safe as other kids. So what does that look like, or what should that look like? Number one, campus leaders need to call it anti-Semitism with the same force, with the same firmness that they call it other forms of hate. If you call out anti-Black racism forcefully, but you don't call it anti-Semitism, your kind of academic philosophy could be best described as hypocrisy. So, number one, call out anti-Semitism with the same consistency, with the same clarity that you call it other forms of intolerance. Whether it's masquerading as anti-Zionism or it's out and out anti-Semitism, none of it is okay. Number two, push back and penalize the student groups who violate the codes of conduct at these institutions. There are groups like SJP or JVP or others who frequently will violate, again, the standards and codes of conduct at these institutions, harassing other students, interfering with classes, violating the sanctum of the library or other spaces. And they need to be held accountable, period. That's the only way that you stop people, is you create some deterrence. So when these bad actors, and I would characterize them as very bad actors, behave in such a manner, look, and by the way, other actors should do it too. It just isn't only these groups, but we have watched these groups since 10/7 and even before, but really since 10/7, serially violate the academic environment. And so they need to be held accountable, and the students need to be disciplined appropriately within the bounds of how the university does this. And if you would expel students for serially violating the policies, then expel them. If you would decharter other groups that serially violate policies, then decharter them. They need to take steps. So again, number one, call it out consistently like you do other forms of hate. Number two, address the bad actors in a way that you would any other bad actor. Number three, if you have DEI programming or like diversity education programming on campus, make sure it includes anti-Semitism and hate. I mean, ADL is a data-driven organization. We're very research-oriented. And I'm going to tell you, we've done the research. Our own studies indicate that some 82% of students who report having done DEI training on their college university campus have told us it didn't include anything about anti-Semitism or hate. Well, that's nuts. When you consider that Jewish people are the most targeted religious minority in the United States in terms of hate crimes, let alone the trauma that Jews have with 2,000 years of living in exile and dealing with persecution, et cetera. So that needs to be addressed. And number four, I think these universities should consider creating task forces or working groups to ensure that Jewish life is protected and supported on campus. Again, while Jews have succeeded in many respects, we are still at 2-point-something% of the population, a very, very small and vulnerable minority. And again, I think that size, that vulnerability, leads me to conclude we deserve the same degree of protection as any other small and vulnerable group. And so I don't think all the answers are available like that, but there ought to be ways for, again, students and faculty and alumni and administrators, maybe even donors, other stakeholders, to work together to figure out how do we ensure that Jewish life in our institution is adequately supported and sustained. So, and again, like any good task force or working group, it should be tasked to do something. It should be given a time frame in which to get it done, and then its concrete, actionable recommendations should be implemented. So again, number one, speak out. Number two, apply penalties when appropriate and hold accountable perpetrators who get it wrong. Number three, ensure that anti-Semitism is part of any DEI training. And number four, create working groups or task forces to ensure that Jewish life is protected and supported in the institution.
Jonathan, thank you. Jonathan, one of the most common question asked by our listeners was about the underlying organization of anti-Semitic protests. One listener writes, CAIR, Palestine Solidarity, and Democratic Socialist Party are organizing mobs of people to demand ceasefire resolutions at city councils, school boards, and county supervisory boards throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. Who's funding to this? Responding to these mobs is exhausting Jewish communities, and boards that do not approve ceasefire resolutions have been doxxed and subject to threats and violence. Another listener writes, all the Jewish communities in northern central California have been besieged, having to fight against anti-Semitic mobs. Who's paying for this worldwide pro-Palestinian tidal wave of political protest? What organizations are directing it?
So, in all honesty, like I said before, we're very data-driven and we're very fact-based. I will tell you what I know to be true, but I won't speculate on what I don't know to be true. So I can't say I don't know who is quote unquote funding these groups. We have seen that some of these protesters are paid. They're not necessarily, organically just showing up, actually getting paid to do some of these protests. We've seen that here in New York, where I am today. We do know that a lot of them A lot of this work has been coordinated by a handful of groups. I mentioned a couple a minute ago that are particularly, prevalent on college campuses. There are groups that are off campuses, like American Muslims for Palestine, like American Task Force for Palestine, the Answer Coalition, and yes, as the question asked about the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. These folks are definitely involved in a number of these protests. Again, I don't know with certainty who's paying for it. There are rumors that Qatar is paying for it. I don't know that that's true. I do think something that is true is that many of these institutions of higher learning, universities, colleges, et cetera, have taken a lot of money over the last 10, 20 years from Qatar, from other Gulf countries. And I think to some degree that's contributed to environments where they have been too permissive of anti-Jewish hate. Look, and it's incredibly problematic and wrong. But again, I just don't know for sure, Jeff, who's paying for these people to do these protests.
Ask a question going from colleges to schools. Here's another listener. We've lost the colleges, the listener writes, and now the Unified Well-Financed Anti-Semitic campaign is coming for the elementary schools. In Oakland, California, Jewish parents are pulling out their children and teaching featured common books with Zionist aggressors and sad refugee Palestinian children. And the listener goes on to know, what's the prospect of fighting this battle at the local school level, where, it's being fought at many different levels, but this is a particularly important one for many parents.
So as you when did you go to AJU? Like 3 years ago or 4 years ago?
5 years ago.
5 years ago. So you were there for this whole ethnic studies model curriculum debacle. So I think many of your viewers, especially to the extent they're in California, and I'm guessing you have people from all over the country too, are familiar with this. And to make a long story really short, these were activists, under the guise of introducing ethnic studies into the California K through 12 educational system, which on some level I can appreciate. Again, I'm someone who believes in diversity education, who sees the value in our incredibly heterogeneous, incredibly multicultural, incredibly vibrant society, arguably the most pluralistic country in the world. Makes sense to me to learn about one another. I can be a better manager or a better colleague or a better peer or a better friend if I understand the people around me and what they bring to the table. So I agree with that in principle, but in practice, there were activists who tried to use this as a Trojan horse to put ugly anti-Zionist content into the school curriculum, which was ridiculous and wrong. Really, more than wrong, was sort of reprehensible. So we worked against it, and credit to groups like Stand With Us, and I think AMCHA worked on it, I believe, and certainly JCRC in the Bay Area, and federations and others. Good for them, good for all of us that worked together and got this thing dealt with. But nonetheless, I think I was saying this before, what happens to these crazy activists on these campuses, right? Was we talking about this, Jeff? Am I having deja vu?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the fevered activists, they don't just disappear when they graduate. They get jobs. And what do? Some of them go to, wait for it, teach. And so, it shouldn't surprise us when they try to inject some of their politics into the classroom. And that's just wrong, whether it's in high school or middle school or elementary school or whatever. So, I think we need to push back against it. Through ADL's regional footprint, our office in Los Angeles or Orange County or San Diego or Santa Barbara or the Bay Area, we've been pushing back against this. We're actually suing the city of Santa Ana in the OC behind the orange curtain. I don't know if you've been down there before. You got to get a visa to go through behind the orange curtain. But we've been suing them for trying to insert, again, the Board of Education kind of went around policy, tried to put this sort of curriculum in there. We'll keep fighting it. As parents, you need to keep calling it out, and you can work with ADL. We would be thrilled to work with you to push back on this, because I don't think these teachers should be politicizing our classrooms. I don't think they should be poisoning our kids with this baloney.
Since I asked you several California-based questions, and as you know, we have a national audience, let me ask you a Brooklyn question.
Brooklyn?
ADL had been working on the problem that identifiably Jewish people had been subject to violent attacks long before October 7th. And if anything, it's gotten worse. You've worked on this problem for a long time. It's persisted. A recent study suggested that identifiably Jewish people face threats many, many times greater than the average Jewish person. Why can't this problem be solved?
Well, far superior minds to mine have wrestled with this for ages. Anti-Semitism is sometimes described as the oldest hatred, and it has mutated over the course of history. It has traversed cultures, it has crossed continents, it has endured and lasted throughout these different ages. Sometimes it was kind of a religious-based hate of Jews. Sometimes it was a racialized hate against Jews. Now it's a sort of political hate against the Jewish state. But it has managed to persist, I think, because there is some degree of human nature and the desire to scapegoat the other, to blame someone for your problems. It's easier often than addressing the issues to simply accuse some other party, some sinister, malevolent force of being responsible for what's happened to you. And, the human mind is very susceptible to conspiracies and to kind of, what you might consider sort of crazy ideas. And so conspiracism is a hallmark of anti-Semitism. And in a world like the one we live in today, where cynicism is higher than it's ever been, where there's a distrust of institutions, from organized religion to the political system, to the judiciary, to media, to business, to, multilateral organizations, and on. And you try to understand why are systems failing? Why don't I have what I think I deserve? Why am I being denied the rights I believe I'm entitled to? Why are bad things happening to me? It is often far easier to simply blame the Jew. And so whether it's manifesting as the blood libel, manifesting as sort of denialism, manifesting as delegitimization, manifesting as greed or power, these are sort of tropes, which again have endured over the ages, and they take different forms and shapes. Once it was the Rothschilds, again, then it was Sheldon, now it's Soros, right? Or now it's Larry Fink, if you will. Like, you see how these things, again, they sort of change and shapeshift, but it's that same through line that runs throughout. And I think that's what this is about.
But in terms of Orthodox in terms of Orthodox Jews being beaten up in Brooklyn specifically, this seems to be a population particularly at risk, and a problem that ADL and others have identified, but it doesn't seem to be solved, and is source of particular violence against Jews in terms of the total population. Why does it persist?
I think the Orthodox community is particularly vulnerable for a few reasons. So number one, they often live in places where they're in close quarters with other kind of ethnic or minority communities. So in Brooklyn, for example, they live not in close proximity, they live intermingled with people maybe of Caribbean heritage or, Latino heritage or Middle Eastern heritage and so on. And they dress differently, they speak Yiddish, so they speak a different language. They're very sequestered in their own world, so they're not engaging with the kind of activities that often bring different communities together and facilitate not necessarily assimilation, but some degree of engagement. I mean, they're not playing basketball with the other kids on the court, right? They're not showing up in the same supermarkets. They're not going to the same schools. And so I think you have these communities which live kind of on top of one another, yet they're very separate. And so I think that lack of understanding about, well, who are these people? And why do they dress funny? Why do they eat different food? Why do they speak a different language? And the ignorance that comes with that fuels some of the antipathy that's there. So layer that ignorance, or take that ignorance, layer on top of that the anti-Semitic myths that folks with some degree of influence in those communities, some athletes like a Kyrie Irving, or some quote unquote religious figures, like maybe again, as happened in Jersey City, Black Hebrew Israelites, or as often happens in places like Chicago or Brooklyn, members of the Nation of Islam, or some politicians. And it creates kind of a toxic mix. So the ignorance born out of difference for communities who may be adjacent to one another and yet worlds apart, combined with the persistent anti-Semitism, creates a very difficult and combustible situation. And, the Orthodox Jewish person who chooses to wear, a shidel, or who chooses to wear, traditional garb, if you will, is very easy to spot. And I think in some ways, the same way that we saw in urban environments, frequent attacks during the rise of COVID against Asian Americans, right? We frequently saw elderly, in particular Asian Americans, being targeted and attacked. I think we see similar patterns of harassment and oftentimes violence directed against Orthodox people the same way. So again, ignorance plus anti-Semitism creates a very combustible mix.
Jonathan,
by the way, the answer to that is not to abide by it, but to push back against it, to work to bring those communities together, to work to do education programs. In Brooklyn, we have introduced anti-Semitism awareness programs and anti-bias programs in schools where we have, people of color teaching young Black kids and Orthodox educators teaching Orthodox kids about the communities around them, trying to figure out ways that are accessible to these audiences, communicate what's happening around them, and ultimately bring those people together. So we're working on that. I think the best antidote to intolerance, particularly when it's born out of ignorance, the best antidote is education and exposure. So we work very hard to try to bring that to these communities.
Jonathan, you've been very generous with your time and obviously very busy. Let me conclude by asking you, since we're talking about October 7th and after, about Hamas. You've thought a lot deeply about
I prefer Sabra Hamas. I like Sabra Hamas with my pita. Is that what you mean? Little evidence. Not. I'm trying.
Unfortunately not. How do you understand Hamas?
It's a despicable
political organization, a religious movement, and a terror organization, all of the above. How do you understand it?
Look, Hamas is a terror organization committed not to a Palestinian state, not to sort of some religious emancipation or some form of transcendental enlightenment gained through piety or prayer. It is a terror organization that's got one goal and one goal only: to destroy the Jewish state and to murder or subjugate the people in that country. That's it. You can read their charter. It's very clear. They don't contemplate peaceful coexistence with Israel. So might they have a social welfare arm? Sure. Might they have some political dimension? Okay. But at the end of the day, it's an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is this, organization founded in Egypt, which sought to reestablish a caliphate, reestablish like a classic political entity governed by Sharia law, right, where the Quran was the operating document, not some kind of secular constitution. And the Muslim Brotherhood is willing to use violence to achieve that end. And Hamas is the Palestinian arm of that entity. I mean, that's what they are. So I really deeply, entirely agree with the Israeli government's formulation that they need to dismantle and destroy Hamas, because the organization has said repeatedly, unambiguously, that their goal is, Palestine from the river to the sea, which is a call for annihilation of the Jews and the Jewish state. And they are very clear-eyed about the fact that they will continue to commit 10/7 type massacres again and again and again in order to achieve that end. So I don't think the Israeli government can afford to show any mercy toward these people who have shown no mercy toward the grandmothers and the other elderly and the disabled people and the peace activists who they encountered on 10/7. They murder these people with impunity. They recorded these crimes with glee, and there should be no quarter shown to a people who would commit such savagery. So I have zero tolerance for Hamas and the useful idiots who cheerlead for them.
So President Biden, Vice President Harris, many others in the administration, many other people have said repeatedly, don't conflate Hamas with Gazans. Yet we saw on October 7th that after the fence was breached, many ordinary Gazans came across also and ransacked kibbutzes, spit on Israeli hostages, helped Hamas hide the hostages and the like. But this adds to the complexity of dismantling Hamas, of course. So how do you understand, beyond the core of the organization, its roots in Gaza?
Well, I just want to say clearly, I should have said this at the outset, like I'm not an expert in Palestinian society, and nor do I claim to be. But I do think there are analogies that we can draw, or parallels from which we can learn. And I think, as we saw in Germany in the 1940s, a denazification of that country, because there were members of the SS, and there were members of the Nazi party. And then there were the other Germans who had been official members of the party, who may have been official members of the party, but didn't commit any atrocities. And then there were Germans who might have been members of the party, but didn't stop what they did. And then there were other Germans who saw the aiding and abetting and didn't say anything. So, I've heard reservists who've returned from Gaza and who've been in the homes and been in the hospitals and been in the schools. And they've said, Hamas is like Messi, the soccer player in Gaza. Every house has something lauding Hamas, pictures, paraphernalia, etc. At the end of the day, as we denazified Germany to create a functioning polity that ultimately has contributed greatly to prosperity and peace in the latter half of the 20th century, and certainly into this one. So I think we need to de-Hamasify Gaza. That only happens if you utterly destroy Hamas and you demonstrate the deeply flawed and ultimately failed logic that they have, that they can harm the Jewish state. I mean, they can harm the Jewish state, but they will never, ever, 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 ever undermine it. And so I think it requires fortitude, it requires resolve, it requires strength, and it requires commitment. Look, war is hard. War is ugly. People get killed, innocents get killed. But there is no more moral army, in my opinion, than the IDF. And no army has gone to greater lengths to try to spare civilian lives than the IDF. Compare what they've done in Gaza to what our own country and other allies did in Iraq and Syria over 2 decades. I mean, it's not even close if you look at the actual ratios. I mean, none of these Hamas terrorists wear uniforms. So in the Hamas ministry, which is about as reliable as the Onion, reports on casualty numbers. I mean, yes, you have to take it with a grain of salt, but keep in mind that they conflate everyone with their Hamas people. And I've seen estimates that 9,000 to 10,000 Hamas, quote unquote, soldiers, terrorists have been killed. So if they say whatever, again, you can't believe any of the numbers. I only believe the numbers that come from the government of Israel. So all that being said, I would not suggest that de-Hamasifying Gaza will be easy, but it needs to be done if we ever hope to achieve some kind of long-term peaceful resolution of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians.
Jonathan, you've been very generous with your time. Any last words?
Look, these are the times that try men's souls. It's hard. It will likely continue to be hard for a long time. I think the question for us as ADL is whether or not what we've seen here is a trend or a shift. Have we experienced a trend of anti-Jewish hate that eventually will regress back to a mean? Or is it a shift where the way that we are perceived and the way that we can live in society has changed in an irrevocable way? I will do everything in my power to prevent that shift and use all the resources at my disposal to ensure that it is indeed just a trend. And that not something ADL can do alone. So whether it's Mothers Against College Antisemitism, or these amazing WhatsApp chat, or these other groups that have spun up, or terrific organizations, whether you choose to support ADL or support Jewish Federation of Los Angeles, a terrific organization doing important work, or a group like Stand With Us, based in LA, doing really good work. There are or IAC, which is also based in Los Angeles, doing really good work. There are a lot of great organizations working hard for the benefit of our community. I think people should consider, if you care about these issues, get involved. That could mean writing a check to some of the groups that I've mentioned. It could mean volunteering for some of the groups that I've mentioned. It could mean, writing letters or signing petitions or getting engaged in some way. Even just calling out stuff that you see on social media that you think is violative, or lifting up stuff on social media that you think is valuable. But every one of you has the power. Every one of you has the power to make a difference in this moment. So I'd encourage everyone to dig deep, to find your strength, and to use that superpower, because the Jewish people have never needed you more. I'm Israel.
Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the ADL, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for all this conversation. And thank you to the audience for joining us on this important event. Thanks so very much.
Thank you.